Hi everyone, it's Melissa, and today I am talking about the books that I read in April. I'm actually going to start with the book that I finished last, but that I'm most excited about finishing. That is Stone of Farewell by Tad Williams. This is the second in an epic fantasy, and it just took me so long to read. I really enjoyed it, however. If you're going to pick it up, I would recommend giving it the time and space in your brain, which I didn't really do that well. So there are a lot of characters, a lot of place names, just a lot to keep track of. But a lot of that world building is done in the first book. There's a lot more happening in this book. There are a lot of different points of views, which I think doesn't always work, but I didn't mind it. A lot of the different characters we're following have different bits of information that you need to have all of the information to overthrow the villain in this book. And so it's really interesting to see all of these characters that are separated have different pieces of the puzzle, and you're rooting for them to somehow meet up. But yeah, I would recommend this if you like adult fantasy and are looking to try something new. I mean, this book isn't new, but I don't hear people talk about this, so it's probably one that most people haven't read. And yeah, I would definitely recommend if you are a lover of fantasy. If you've noticed a change in lighting or angle, it's because it is several hours later, the end of the day, and I was editing my footage and realized I forgot to talk about two books, so I'm going to insert them here. Next, I am going to talk about Pet by Akwaeke Emezi. This is a YA dystopian following a young, early teenage girl named Jam, and she lives in a world where there are no more monsters. But one day, a creature emerges from one of her mother's paintings, a creature called Pet, and it says that it is there to hunt a monster. Specifically, that there is a monster in Jam's best friend's house. Now, I liked quite a few things about this book. The first being, I liked how the adults were portrayed. They were well-meaning, loving, and supportive of their kids, but ultimately not entirely believing or just unable to fix their children's problems and just letting their kids down in one way or another. Jam's parents don't believe that there are any monsters yet, and although Jam tries to convince them that there is a monster to be found out, they try to assuage her, they try to quell her fears, saying, "Oh, it's fine, Jam, there are no more monsters left." She knows that she's not going to be able to convince them, so she decides to help Pet herself to hunt down a monster. But even though she kind of takes on this role, I also like how the kids are portrayed in this book, because they aren't unbelievably heroic. There's just something that needs to be taken care of, and the parents aren't going to believe it, so they have to take matters into their own hands. But the kids, they don't know what to do. They don't know where to start. I thought the story was really compelling, and I thought the magical realism really worked. And overall, I really enjoyed it. The next book I want to talk about is How the One-Armed Sister Sweeps Her House by Cherie Jones. This book is set on Barbados in a city or an area called, literally called Paradise. But that's basically a facade. This is paradise only for tourists and really rich people. And for the locals, the real paradise is fraught with poverty and violence. The first thing that really struck me while reading this book was how claustrophobic it feels. Despite this tropical setting where you think of open beaches and wide open blue skies and vast ocean, it felt tight and isolated and cramped. So the story primarily, there are multiple points of view, but it primarily follows Lala, who is, I think she's around 18 or 19 years old during the kind of bulk of the story. And it's about the abusive relationship she finds herself in, the situations she finds herself in, the inescapable situations she finds herself in We get her backstory, her upbringing, her mother's upbringing, and we really get this very complete sense of like where she comes from, where her mind's at, why she thinks the way she does, why she makes the choices that she does. And the same can really be said for almost all of the characters in this book, even ones who aren't really main characters. We get some backstory, we get their motivation, we understand why they are the way they are. It had really interesting characters from many different backgrounds, and it made the story very rich. And the stories were, from the different like points of view, were all woven together really well, and I found the ending satisfying without tying things up too neatly. So yeah, I would really recommend this. Now we are going to jump back to the original footage where I am going to be talking about a graphic short story collection, Into the Woods by Emily Carroll. So this was a collection of, I think there were 5 different short stories, horror short stories, I guess, based on like fairy tale and folklore. I really enjoyed this. The pacing was really good, and the building of the tension throughout each story was, I thought, excellent. And I also really liked the atmosphere. It was very creepy, very foreboding. My issue with the collection were the endings of the stories. So I think pretty much every story either ended sort of ambiguously or on a cliffhanger, and I wouldn't have minded like a couple of stories ending this way, but because they all did, I just never felt a sense of satisfaction. But if you aren't bothered by the lack of like sense of conclusion, then I would definitely recommend this, and I think the art style worked really well with the stories. So on to the nonfiction that I read in April. First up is a graphic memoir called The Best We Could Do by Thi Bui. And this chronicles the author's family, their escape from Vietnam in the 70s, and also their life in America once they moved there. The book also delves into her parents' lives before the Vietnam War and really talks about what was going on in Vietnam at that time, all of the precursors to the war, which I personally didn't really know much about. So in addition to it being, I think, a really great memoir, I think in terms of the history of Vietnam as a country, from like the 30s to 70s, I thought it was really good in that regard as well. She wrote this with a lot of care and compassion, but was still very, very honest. I think a lot of this book almost reads like a tribute to her parents, but it doesn't gloss over the ways that she was frustrated with her parents growing up. And the illustrations are beautiful. I think the color palette especially really works for the story. There were a lot of very muted earth tones, a lot of browns and light greens and rusty reds, which gave it a little bit of that 70s aesthetic, but also kind of doubled as a sort of sepia look, or that kind of a look into the past type of aesthetic as well. And I think the tone of the story did not call for vibrant colors, so I think just the colors really complemented the writing really well. So the next nonfiction I want to talk about is Eloquent Rage by Brittney Cooper. So this is a collection of essays about feminism and the author sort of learning like the power of rage and anger, and how Black feminism is really needed and how she came to know it. Now, the fact that it was a collection of essays wasn't apparent to me at first. I didn't realize that going into it, so that's on me. But while I was reading it, I didn't really realize that until a couple of essays in, because the first 2 essays go together a bit more than some of the others, so it kind of felt just like another chapter continuing that story. So I thought I was reading a book that was going to be more chronological or more progressive about Cooper's journey through learning about Black feminism and how to use it, and that's what I thought I was getting. But it wasn't until I was past those two first essays, because the third one is quite disconnected from the topic of the previous two, that I realized, oh, this is a collection of essays. And while overall I enjoyed it, I think I probably would have rather read the book that I thought. I would have rather have read a nonfiction book that explored a couple of the themes she talked about, but in more detail, rather than a lot of different essays about quite a few different things. I especially liked the sections that dealt with respectability politics, and the sections dealing with these like no-win scenarios that Black women are often have to deal with. So there were several examples of this in the book. A couple relating to like education and the fact that if a Black woman doesn't get educated, it can be, harmful or disadvantageous in these ways. But if she does decide to go to college, then it disadvantages her in these other ways. So those sections I found really well done and well thought out. What I think that Cooper does really well is contextualizing these issues. She gives a lot of examples pulling from like modern events, pop culture, celebrities, and it really provides a good picture of what she's talking about and what she's trying to say, in contrast to like providing more of like a history of Black feminism. Although she does cite sources and cite like where these ideas came from. It wasn't really so much about that. I really liked the bluntness of her writing. It really cuts to the chase. There wasn't a lot of fluff, and that made it really understandable. But at the same time, I think there was a lot of nuance missing in some places, because I think she was trying to make it so readable and accessible maybe, that I think it lost a little bit of that. And there were a few things that I would have like expanded more. So the next nonfiction I want to talk about is another memoir, Mamaskatch by Darrel J. McLeod. So this is a memoir about growing up Cree in Alberta, and I think he was in BC for a while as well, but in Western Canada. And it is a real time capsule of the 60s and 70s in this particular part of Canada. What is very interesting about the author's life really and about this book is all of the like intersection of different identities. So namely, he's Indigenous, he's gay, he was also like born again Christian for a while. There was just a lot going on in his life, a lot of different identities that he was grappling with. I think what this memoir does really well is display how quickly life changed for Indigenous people in just one generation. So his mother grew up with Cree as her first language. She, lived on the land in this little like cabin in the woods with her grandfather and like other relatives. And then she was taken at a young age to residential school. And you can see in the memoir how the racism and religious trauma and physical abuse she faced there not only impacted her, but impacted her children, like her entire family. So it's about, the author's own personal traumas, like the abuse and racism that he faced himself, and also this layer of intergenerational trauma, these things that he and his siblings inherited through their mother's life experience, through her trauma. I think he writes about his mother in such an interesting way. It's this mixture of like fondness and love, but also of frustration and resentment. It's hard to reconcile how she loved her children, fought to accept them, like despite queerness. Like one of her children comes out as trans, like back in the 70s, and the first words out of her mouth are, "We have to accept him, we have to accept him." But it's hard to reconcile that woman and the love and acceptance of her children, and also her efforts to instill a pride of being Cree, a pride of being Indigenous to her children. It's hard to reconcile that woman with a woman who struggled with alcohol addiction, who could be violent to her family, who neglected her children, and who wasn't a stable or safe figure in their lives. So this memoir was just told with a lot of honesty about like the complexity of relationships, and I really highly recommend it. The last two things I read in April were a couple of poetry collections, which I will just touch on very briefly because I still don't really know how to review poetry collections very well. But I read River Woman by Katherena Vermette. So this is a Canadian poet. She is Métis. And this collection had a lot of imagery surrounding, obviously, like rivers and water and movement, but just like landscape, like in general. And there was a lot of like metaphor and like different language around like people and their relationship to that landscape, not just natural landscapes, but like urban landscapes as well, and how we are inextricably connected to place. And there's a lot of themes in here about like splintering and breaking apart and like deconstruction as well. I really enjoyed this, and she's an author slash poet that I would definitely pick up again. The other poetry collection I read was Daybreak by Gwen Benaway. So she is a trans woman of Indigenous descent, and this entire collection really did focus on the experiences living as a trans woman. Almost exclusively experiences relating to sex and relationships, although I think there were a couple of poems in there that weren't necessarily about that, but there's a lot of stuff in there about bodies in relation to like sex and romantic relationships. The collection I think is very intense. There were a few like very pointed and poignant like lines that really stuck out to me that I thought were very impactful, carefully constructed, and said in a way that really resonated. However, the poetry style, like on the whole, is one that just doesn't work for me. It's very like observational, like factual, like realist, I guess. And I prefer something that's a bit more like metaphorical or emotional, or just not as straightforward, maybe would be the way to say it. I think if you like the poetry collection Disintegrate, Dissociate by Ariel Twist, you will really like this one. They're similar in that both poets are trans and Indigenous, and the poems focus on those topics heavily. But aside from that, I also found the style similar as well. But I think that Daybreak is maybe a slightly more polished version than the Ariel Twist collection. So I think if you liked Ariel Twist's collection, you would really like this one. So that's everything I read in April. If you've read any of these, please let me know what you thought about them in the comments below. And thanks everyone for watching, and we'll chat soon. Take care.